There's a battle outside and it's raging. It'll sure shake your windows and rattle your walls. But the times they are changing. Yes, they're changing.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of MindShift Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. I am super excited to be bringing you this episode today. This is a live podcast that Stacie Rae and I did back on the 16th of September in the Seattle, Washington area when I was visiting the States. A lot of people had come down the night before September 15th to watch the Derek Webb concert in Seattle, and so we timed this live podcast to coincide with that, so that a lot of people had come down from Canada, people came up from Portland and obviously the Seattle area. And so we wanted to do this live podcast, which we did at my friend Big Steve's studio in the Kent, Washington area, which is just southeast of Seattle. Stacie and I had done a lot of talking leading up to this live podcast because we knew we were going to have a live audience, and probably for a few months beforehand, we had been putting out posts on Twitter and Facebook and different places asking people to put up questions and submit topics for us to discuss. And in going around and around on this, Stacie and I were talking about 2 or 3 weeks before the podcast, and we decided that, what's really important is we need to focus on this element of reconstruction after deconstruction. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and I've been focusing on with some of the newer podcasts that have come out. This idea that we think a lot of times if you're an ex-evangelical, ex-fundamentalist, ex-Christian, whatever, you've walked away from religion, that's the point. And that is huge. Obviously, it's huge to walk away from your former faith. It was our very identity. It formed our theological worldview. If you were a Christian like me, you based your decisions on prayer and the Bible, and you went to church every day for years. My whole life, I was part of the church. I was a pastor. I was a teacher. I was teaching students for ministry. I was serving the church for well over 20 years. And yet I walked away from all of it. And now I'm looking back thinking, okay, that was a huge decision. And obviously it was huge. But what next? Because I've realized that my very identity was wrapped up in all of those things I just described and more. That's who I thought I was. That was the person I was. Who was Clint Haycock? Well, he was a teacher, he was a pastor, he was a student, he was a whatever. But it all somehow revolved around being an evangelical Christian. And yet I've discovered that that's not the end goal in this whole thing of deconstruction. Actually, it is but part of this journey. The next step, the next phase of the journey is to reconstruct. It's to form a completely new identity that is no longer based on all of those things I just described and more. And so maybe this describes you as well. You're thinking to yourself, okay, I've walked away from the church. I've walked away possibly from my Christian faith. I don't know where you are on that spectrum, but where do you go from here? And this is something that Stacie and I realized this is really, really an important thing, and it covers a wide range of topics in virtually every area of our life. And it takes a long time to disentangle yourself from religion. This is something that I talked about with my sister Valerie on last week's podcast. How have our lives changed specifically in the last year since we did our podcast a year ago, which we entitled Surviving a Fundamentalist Upbringing. In fact, I'm just going to mention right here, if you haven't heard that, you should go back and listen to it. It's really a good episode because a year ago we focused on the effects of being raised in a fundamentalist context and going to church in a fundamentalist evangelical context, what that did to us, how that affected our lives in so many ways. And in the last year, both of our lives have changed radically. And I guess you could say we have started to reconstruct after the deconstruction. And as I said, deconstruction, we used to think was the point, but it really isn't the end goal, the end game. It's actually to reconstruct. And also, obviously, we're still going to be deconstructing as time goes on. So it's part and parcel of this whole journey. Now, one of the things I want to announce to you that's really cool, I've been working on, and I put it up on Patreon, at least the first one anyway. I'm working on an online course called Reconstruction After Deconstruction. It's going to be a series of videos. I'm going to be putting out one a month. And the first one is free. You can take a look at it and see if you think it's something that you want to engage in. I'm going to be putting up a new video probably about once a month. And this is going to be aimed at Patreon supporters of MindShift Podcast. So you can find out more information. I'm going to put a link to the video in the show notes of this episode. And there's also some great rewards for people who want to support what I'm doing on Patreon. You can have early access to every episode. I tend to drop them on Wednesdays, so you don't have to wait till Friday when they come out normally. Also, I do a lot of behind the scenes recordings with some of the guests that I end up having on the show, so you can get a kind of behind the scenes look of what we talk about. And also, I'm doing more and more content on there as I interact with some of the great things I'm learning from the various guests. So these things are all available for you on Patreon. And again, the link to that is in the show notes, as well as how to get a hold of me. You can follow me on Twitter at MindShift 2018, which is probably the best way to get a hold of me. And there's a bunch of other connections, which again are going to be in the show notes. So I am excited to be bringing you this episode today. This features, as I said, me and Stacie Rae with a live audience, recorded on the 16th of September of 2018. A live podcast, and we get into a lot of great topics with some of the members of the audience. And in fact, we had a great discussion. 2 brothers showed up that I'd never met before, and we get into some really good stuff. And then after the podcast was over, a bunch of us, we all went to lunch at a nearby restaurant. And in fact, it's a funny thing because there was a guy who showed up right as the podcast was about ready to finish, but he did show up for the lunch after the podcast. And he was such an interesting guy that I thought, you know what? We need to do a podcast with him. And so I'm going to be bringing you that in a few weeks. His name's Jimmy Brower, and that is an absolutely fascinating discussion. Here's a guy who's deconstructed, but a lot of it is his former fundamentalist beliefs, but he still considers himself some form of Christian. And this is really fascinating to understand how someone can go through that process, still believe to be a Christian. And so there's some good content coming your way. There's another one coming up with Steve Slocum as we talk about his book, Why Do They Hate Us? Talking about Muslim, really American, not so much Christian, but Muslim American relations or Muslim Western relationships. And next week, I've got Sherry Palace coming your way. This is a great conversation that we had talking about how man has ruined God. And this is kind of her passion. And then I've also got a podcast with Andrew Gurovich. I went down to Portland in Oregon and we did a fantastic podcast again on this subject of Reconstruction after Deconstruction. So there's some great content coming your way. So stay tuned for all those episodes right here on MindShift Podcast. All right. I think we've done enough business to get it out of the way. So here we go on into our live podcast recorded on the 16th of September with me and Canadian author, the Resting Traveler, Stacie Rae, with this edition of Reconstruction after Deconstruction. So welcome everyone to the MindShift Live Podcast. Yay! Come on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that was painful. Come on.
Come on, you can do better than that.
Okay.
Welcome to the Live MindShift Podcast.
Yeah!
So we are here talking with Stacie Rae, who came all the way down from Canada today. So thank you. Yay! America Junior, as Homer Simpson said. Oh, that's Homer Simpson's word, not mine.
Ouch!
America's top hat.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Oh, ouch. That's even worse. So Stacie was on the podcast, what was it, a year ago? I think it was. Was it that long ago?
Not that long ago.
Okay, 6 months ago. I don't know. But how's your life changed? Because when we talked on our podcast, you just came out with your book, or you were about to come out with it.
I think
Has your life
just
changed?
come out with it. It was
Okay.
only released, like, I think a month maybe when you and I chatted.
So
It's
it was
good.
hot
It's-
off the presses.
It's actually doing really well. It's been, I got picked up by Indigo, actually, a couple
Right.
stores. So that's like Kohl's and Chapters and all that. So that's really cool. And I have found amazing success in like small little shops that are kind of looking for that unique, intimate type book.
Right.
So yeah, things are going really well. And the message of identity, because that's what it's about. People are like starting to actually give me feedback now and tell me, hey, like I didn't know that about myself. Or the famous one is that the first 3 chapters are hell. So you guys actually are getting a copy free,
Hey.
but just as a warning, it should have a label on it. Warning, chapters 1 through 3 are like hell. So you have been warned.
You're going back through your personal hell.
Yeah, it's like, it's all allegoric, but it's definitely something that's like self-reflective. So people are telling me that it's really difficult because they don't always want to go to those parts of your deep, right? And I force you to.
Right. You have to go back.
You have to go back. Yeah.
And that's the whole thing. We're talking about reconstruction after deconstruction. So I don't know where you guys are at on your journey, but I feel like for me personally, this is something I'm now just starting to really understand that I have to do, because something we've been talking about off and on for the last couple of months before we did this podcast. I came over from Britain. She came down from Canada. Neither one of us even live here, man. We don't even live in this place.
No.
I grew up here, actually. I grew up like 15 minutes from here, so I'm a local boy, but you're not really local. But
no, last time I was here was like 20 years ago. So.
Yeah. But we've been talking about this theme of reconstruction after deconstruction, and I mean, somehow the book must play into that as well. So you gotta, because this whole issue of if you take away the things that we used to rely on, as if you came out of evangelicalism, you're talking about the Bible, God, spirituality, church, community, all those things that, I mean, I grew up in evangelicalism. You pretty much did too.
Completely.
So you walk away not only from the church piece, which is one element you have to deconstruct, because this is something David Hayward and I talked about. In fact, the podcast that just came out Friday, he's Canadian too, actually.
Yeah, he's amazing.
The Naked Pastor. And he said there's two pieces to the deconstruction. There's the deconstruction from the church piece, which is huge. Mm-hmm. And then there's the deconstruction of our theological beliefs. Now they're both deep, because there's a social cost, I think, to be paid in many ways for both. Have you felt like you've paid a social cost if you walked away from the church? Or I don't know what your thoughts are, what your backstory is, but that's
there's like
something we need to talk
relationship
about.
and everything, right? Because everything is constructed around your church family. Your church is basically your entire life source. And if you take that away, I found anyway, that everything else got taken away too.
Yeah. I mean, in my case, I was really lucky because we had moved to Britain. We've been living there for 12 and a half years. I went over there to do a PhD, and I had come off the back of a really horrible church experience. I was a pastor down in Portland for 12 years, and the church, actually, we closed it down. It was so dysfunctional. There's a long story, messy story, but I got blamed for everything, the whole thing. They blamed me for all of it, and it was all my fault, and it was all these evil machinations to take over the building, and it was horrible. But when I went to Britain, I was so burned out on church and Christians. I didn't want to have anything to do with the church ever again. But then we got involved in the church. We kind of got sucked into this church. But
that's how
I was having a problem. Yeah. Well, we it's a long story, but the people that put us up, they let us live with them for a while. And they were like, they'd been previewing our visit, or the fact we were going to be moving there. Everyone's so excited to meet you. You have to come to our church. We're kind of like, really?
Ouch.
We have to go to your church. But then we went, and the people were amazing. I mean, I'm not going to lie. They were amazing. We built a lot of profound relationships, and I think we healed a lot from our emotional damage coming off the back of that experience. But what was happening, I was studying preaching, actually, for my degree. And I was kind of breaking down the communication model of the way they were doing it. And I was having a lot of problems with it. So then began the theological / other part of the deconstruction. And I'm sitting in church every Sunday going, okay, I think I know what you're doing, and I think I know why you're doing it, and I don't agree with it. Mm-hmm. So these were all pieces and bits that went into it. Then I started voicing my concerns to the leadership. That didn't go over too well.
No.
Shockingly.
They
didn't want to hear it, Hey. So, yeah, I was getting more and more frustrated. So that's when we walked away. At 6 years, we were there at this church in Chester, in Great Britain. But because, as I said, why I got lucky was we weren't around family because we lived across the world. We walked away from the church, but we didn't feel like we had that big social cost to pay like maybe some of you have, because you've got maybe friends and family that are still in the system. That's a problem, isn't it?
It's a huge problem, because there's a community that I built, and those people were so central to my life that when I started to remove myself from the theology, then those people whom I loved started to show me a little bit about who they truly were, because their theology was more important to them than their relationship with me. Right. And so then you not only are losing a theology, and you're losing suffering that is coming from your theology, but now you're losing people that supported you, that I personally realized actually didn't love me as much as I thought they did. Like, they just kind of loved the idea of me in their system. So,
and what you could do for them.
What I could do for them, like being that I was in worship, so like worship leader, and I was always asked to do all different kinds of tasks and administration, and like I was just that person. If you need something, I will help you. And when I started to stand up to the man, you know, like
the system
got a little angry with me.
A little pushback.
Yeah. So we definitely didn't make a lot of friends during that time. We lost a lot of friends. And I found for myself that the loneliness was the greatest struggle I had. And that's actually how the book was written. Suffering is like something you can't do alone. Yeah. If you're suffering, you have to have people with you. And I had nobody because all of those people had left. So then if you're in immense torment with all the things that you're like, it's a house of cards. We were talking about this earlier.
Yeah.
Everything starts to fall and you have nobody to go to and you don't even know the depth of what has just fallen and you don't even know how to put it back together. And then in the middle of all that for myself, like I've got family problems and I've got personal tragedy and everything is somehow all woven together and there's nobody there to come and help you pick it up. You're completely on your own. And what that did for me was it actually led me to understand a greater piece of that theology was that I had never actually believed that this God was actually there. Like I had finally found that component that said, oh wow, deep in your recesses, you actually think that God will leave you. Because we were taught that if we didn't obey him, if we didn't have the magical ticket to heaven, we would be cast aside. We would be alone forever, eternally. And so once everything collapsed, that's how this book was written, because I had to start actually invading my suffering and acknowledging these things. I think that was probably the scariest part for me, was acknowledging what I believed and how blind. Yeah. I felt so foolish that I had believed so many horrendous things.
That's the problem. You get into deconstructing the theological beliefs. I don't know about where you guys are at, but it's really scary. I mean, I was a pastor, I was a teacher for probably the last 20 years of my life. It's been spent either in preparing for ministry, doing ministry, teaching others to go into ministry at a Bible college. I mean, I've spent my whole life in service to the church somehow. And I'm looking back on what the hell? What was I doing? Why was I thought I knew why I was doing it at the time.
Yeah.
So it's your whole identity, your whole life is wrapped up. And this is something David Hayward said, going back to the Naked Pastor. He said, religion is all pervasive, down to the cellular level. It affects every single area of our life. And I started thinking about that. And I said, it's so true. Because every decision that we made, or I made, I will say for me, had to be filtered through the lens of what does the Bible say? What's God's will? That was probably the biggest
Relationships,
one.
jobs,
everything.
Sexuality, everything is filtered through that lens.
Where you live, where you buy your house, what you do with your life. It's somehow, and I remember wrestling, like for example, when we were preparing to move to Britain, it took 2 years to put all the pieces together. We agonized, literally, praying, God, what's your will? Should we do this? Should we do? And how do you know what God's will is? Seriously. And, that whole piece of it, I look back and why didn't we just go?
Why didn't we just go?
We say, exactly. I want to live in another country and we can do it on a student visa. Let's just go. What's stopping? No. God, is this your will? Is this your will? Is this your will?
All fear.
We're just agonizing over this stuff.
What if you make the wrong choice? Then what?
Oh. Well, and I said, someone said, that God doesn't close a door, but he opens a window. And you go, okay, but if he closes the door, maybe we're not supposed to go through the door.
I don't typically go through windows either. So just saying, like, when doors close, I don't typically go, I'm going to go through the window now. I typically go and find a key or another door, just saying.
It seems like an all-powerful God might be able to just open the door. Like,
right?
He's got the keys. Yeah.
No, you have to open the door yourself.
I don't know who sees an open window and thinks, like, oh, that's consent to...
Burglars, dude. Open window, I can steal your stuff. Hey, it's theologically sound, so why wouldn't I do it? I mean, I heard God doesn't close the door, you open the window. I'm having your stereo, your TV, your car, you know.
It's the will of the Lord. I mean,
It's God's will.
my hands are tied. I gotta go through this window now. Like,
Standing before the judge in court. Why did you steal all this guy's stuff? Well, theologically. Guys, I mean, yeah, it's God's
The
will.
logic is so absurd with everything. When I look back, I feel like an idiot. Like, how did I agree to all of that stuff? Like, it
That's
just
what we were
blows
told.
my mind.
I mean, I was raised in it, so I heard it all from literally day one. I was in church when I was a baby. I think I was a
Me
week
too.
old.
Yep.
My mom took me to church when I was a baby, and I was in church my whole life
Yep.
up until
I didn't know any
10,
different.
11 years
like,
ago.
exactly. Like, that's the thing. Like, it's not a failing of intellect. It's like that was your environment. Like,
That's
that's
true.
where you're built.
Yeah.
Like,
It's your worldview.
it's not, like, no one is stupid for believing it. It's like where they are at that point in their life. A lot of really smart people are religious. Like,
Oh, yeah.
like, it's just like,
No, that's a very good
It's
point.
not about intellect,
Well,
is
that's
it?
that's why there's such a focus towards getting the young people, because
Yes,
when
exactly.
your brain is formative, you're like, so for me, I was like 4 or 5 years old, and I latched onto the concept of original sin, and I was like, there is something fundamentally wrong
Yeah.
with me
Ouch.
because I am a human,
You're bound for hell.
and so I like resented my existence because I was like an evil human, and
Yeah.
so I was destined for hell, and so was everybody else, and so that was like my identity growing up, and so I had to kind of like. I had all this cognitive dissonance because of that.
And welcome performance issues.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. And so it was just kind of like, it's just one of those things where it's like, this is day one, this is what you're told, this is all you know. And so that's the framework you have to filter everything through. Because like if you're 4 or 5 years old and an adult tells you something, you have to believe
You
yeah.
believe it. Yeah.
Like, it's just an evolutionary like trait. You have to believe what the adults say until you can fend for yourself.
Yeah.
And so when you're told that about yourself and that's your fundamental belief, like it kind of affects a lot of different things.
Yeah.
There
It
is no
can be
choice.
very traumatic.
Yeah.
And the thing is, then there's so many threads that come off of that original sin doctrine, isn't it? Because then you could put the Calvinist piece in there and say, okay, and not only are you
Yeah.
bound for hell, if you're not one of the elect,
Mm.
there's nothing you can do.
Yep.
You're still going to go to hell.
But we still need you to try.
Yeah.
Because you don't know if you're the elect. or
That's the
not.
problem.
Right?
How do we know if we're
Yeah.
elect? Because
But we don't know. So
We
you
don't
better
know.
cover your ass just in case.
cover your ass.
Get your golden ticket.
And that's part of the trauma, as you say, the hell-induced PTSD, which is a thing.
Oh yeah.
That it's a real thing. I mean, counselors have talked about this when dealing with people who have come out of religion. And it's not necessarily Christianity, I would say. I think I've seen a lot of commonalities in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There tends to be a lot of, because they tend to be patriarchal,
Yeah.
Abrahamic religions.
Yeah.
They're almost indistinguishable. If you look at a fundamentalist from any one of those
Yeah.
three faiths.
No, I started listening
They're very
to
similar.
The Atheist Experience really recently, which is it's a podcast radio show where basically atheists, there are usually like 2 atheists on a panel, and then anybody can call, but it's usually a theist that calls in and
Right.
tries to argue a point.
Mm.
There's a guy.
Like, and they're arguing Matt Dillahunty, and like average Joe Christian is arguing Matt
Yeah.
Dillahunty. It's like,
Not
what do
gonna
you,
happen.
who do you think you're gonna
Yeah, you're in
change?
the wrong category
Yeah.
here.
You're kind of out of your depth, but like
Doesn't stop
Muslims
us
will
from
call
trying.
too. Like a lot of different religions will call in. Any kind of theist, really. Listening to Muslims use the same arguments
Exactly.
is fascinating to me, because it was always kind of like they were the other. They were even worse than like the atheists. Like they were trying to take over America and all this.
Yeah.
And so like hearing the same exact arguments from their mouths
Oh, absolutely.
that I would have given myself
Yeah.
at the time, like, is just like there's no,
That is.
it's all the same. Like
It
there's
is very,
no real
very
difference.
similar, if
Like,
not the same.
It's
That's
just a
it.
small
Yeah.
change in the dialects, but
Yeah.
it's the same
Yeah.
message. Absolutely.
And
different
same method.
iterations, but
The
the
same
same
method as well,
Yes,
too.
yes.
That's
And they're
actually-
arguing from those same presuppositions
Yeah.
and so forth. You know, so and you see the same, because I've done a lot of work with different people that I've had on the podcast. Karen Garsh, the famous faithless feminist. There's one coming out in a couple of weeks with Dr. Josie McSkimming. She's from Australia. She's a clinical therapist as well. And these people report this, and it's the same thing. She's in Australia, and Karen Garsh is in Oregon. They're reporting the same symptoms. from people that have come out of religion.
Because all those symptoms are leading to the same thing, where we are losing identity. We don't understand who we are because we're following a rhetoric. And clearly, like you're saying, that's not just the Christian culture, but this is, I think, a religious tone overall, that we're conforming people to a certain viewpoint. And at the same time, culture generally is telling us to be unique and be ourselves, and it's okay to have your own sexual preferences. But religion, and as we've already expressed, is so fully encompassing our lives that there has to be this huge, I know for myself there is, this huge conflict that's always occurring because I'm being told, be free, be liberated. No, you have to stay like this, and our identities are completely lost. And no wonder we have PTSD, and no wonder we have anxieties and stresses. Like, that is honestly like my heart to spread my message through the concepts of leaving religion, and especially the evangelical part of that, is about helping people restore identity, because it's only then that I think we could actually move forward in the liberation that we know is for us. Like, you have to, unfortunately, embrace all of that horribleness, depression,
That's
anxiety.
the thing. You gotta somehow find a way to integrate that. That's something like, again, I'm not stealing everything from David Hayward, but I learned so much from your dad, because he said, you can't just wall that part of your life off. Well, you can, actually.
Well, Christians will tell you can, and you should.
Your backstory, it's part of the person that we're becoming.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to find a way, he said, to embrace that and actually integrate that into this reconstruction piece. Now, that's very difficult.
Embracing in the sense, I think, though, of admitting it. Like, how many of us we've actually admitted, even though it's scary, and I know that some of us, we can't admit this fully to some people in our lives. Like, I totally am careful who I say what to, a little less now because I'm publicly doing this kind of stuff now. But I was
live,
super
by the way.
careful. Oh yeah, we're live.
Whoops, take it back.
But I had to start admitting it to myself and admitting my truth publicly, because that is part of the process of actually moving forward. And like we were talking today about moving into reconstructing, because we have to get to this point where we understand these are the steps broadly to how to deconstruct. But then I kind of feel like we're at this place where do we go next? And like that's something that you and I have been talking about, is it's how do we put this back together?
Right. What's next?
That's very terrifying. Because
we've learned, and I've learned this in my case, that I spent a lot of time when I was deconstructing, bashing the church, and in a way, rightly so, because of all the problems and issues that we came out of. My backstory and everyone else's, a lot more horrific stories than mine. But yet, that can be a very unhealthy place if you stay there. I've learned that just to kind of live in that anger and the bitterness. And you see a lot of posts in different places about the church did this and the church did that, and you have to honor that. But as you say, we got to move somehow past that without discounting what happened, because you don't want to minimize it. You don't want to say, "Oh, you're fine. There's no problem." Well, I was going to say, I put a tweet out a couple of weeks ago, and I got a lot of responses on it. I thought it might be interesting to throw it out there and see what you guys think. But my original tweet said, if you're an ex-evangelical who's long since done the deconstruction piece of your former beliefs, how would you say you've been able to do the reconstruction piece? And then I wrote some issues. I said, it seemed like some issues might include, number one, dealing with mental health issues left over from religion. So we've got the depression, the anxiety,
which
the
is
PTSD.
what Karen Gars works with. Is that correct?
She's talking with women specifically who have left religions, and it's quite interesting. So there's a lot of baggage that we have. So that's a piece of it. Another one, issues around sexuality, purity culture, gender identity. I mean, on and on. The list is virtually endless there. And number three, dealing with possible abuse. That is sexual or spiritual abuse. I mean, there's been horrific stories, emotional abuse. Number four, learning to formulate a new identity. And we mentioned this, now that the familiar things that we used to rely on are gone. So we got the God piece, the Bible piece, the theological, whatever that means for you. That's not part of that's what we used to use. And now I started getting into some of the things people told me about making amends to your children if you raise them in evangelical. That is a huge piece.
I actually have a little experience in that, where my mother has actually apologized and said, like, we didn't know any better. It actually was hugely relieving and forgiving not even just her, but like a generalized church body.
Yeah.
Because just having someone acknowledge that they have participated in harming you, hugely healing.
Thinking they were doing all the right things for all the right reasons.
That's a huge step, I think. Huge.
When I got a message from a gal named Lynn, and that's why I put that in there. And this is what she said. This is a heartbreaking question. She said, "Here's my question for your podcast." She said, "My question is, how does one heal from fundamentalist evangelical crap?" Okay, Lynn, what are you talking about? How does one ever forgive themselves when they were brainwashed into thinking that if parents were to obey God, they needed to use the rod on their kids and spank them for any act of disobedience? I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I got spanked thousands of times by my parents, thinking they were doing all the right things. And she says, how does one even go about living with oneself, knowing how much psychological and emotional and spiritual harm that one did to her children? You can just feel the pain coming out of Lynn's. How does one go about trying to repair a relationship that was so damaged by all this toxic parenting? And I'll say it. She says, even abusive parenting. Then she concludes, she says, I don't know. I know it doesn't mean anything, but at the time my intentions were good. I didn't seek out to hurt my kids. My goal was to follow God. My goal was to follow the Bible and obey what God said. I believed if I didn't spank my kids when they disobeyed, that I was disobeying God.
And therefore would be sent to eternal punishment. Yeah.
So don't have kids, so I can't quite relate in that intimate of a regard, but we were way into like the charismatic branch of Christianity.
Yeah.
So like speaking in tongues, words of knowledge, prophecy, healing, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I remember at one of those like youth revival things where it's just like, you know, the music's playing, everybody's amped up on emotion, you're in basically an altered state, and everything's just manipulating your brain to think that God's directly involved in this situation, but it's just psychology. And so I remember at one point I like looked over, I saw a dude in the corner who was clearly distraught. It's very obvious, but like in that state, I saw him and I thought it was God telling me to go talk to him. It was really just compassion.
Yeah, it wasn't, sorry for the guy.
Yeah, I felt sorry for the guy, so I just wanted to go. Yeah, it was a very human response. Like, oh, maybe I can help this guy, but it was colored with the lens of God's telling me I should go talk to this guy. And so I went over and talked to the guy, and we didn't really talk about anything substantive. But I gave him a word of knowledge, so-called.
I love your quotes since you said that. That was amazing.
Word of knowledge.
Yeah. So, and in retrospect, I feel so bad about it because it was just platitudes. All it was is very basic, like any fortune teller could do this. It's just, you see a distraught person, you tell them some kind of encouraging things that are super vague and ambiguous, but they can ascribe very specific meaning to. And I thought I was like right on the money. I thought it was like, I just delivered the word of God to this dude, and he clearly had a very positive reaction to it. So it's just like, awesome. And then I watched a video where an illusionist who is an atheist took an atheist like stem cell researcher, really, really smart person, and using manipulative methods of illusion and psychology and all this kind of stuff, he tricked her into having a very spiritual religious experience. It was all it was all mind games. And I saw that and I was just like going back in my mind to all the times I've done that to everybody else. Yeah. Like, cause I've done, that was one example, but I've done that so often. I was I was all in. So it was if I had that opportunity, I would do that. And I'm like, how much damage did I do thinking I was doing God's work?
And that's the question for me though, because there's times when that has happened and you probably gave him some hope in what you said, which is so impacting.
Yep.
But at the same time, depending what you said could have actually altered his entire perspective on life, decisions. If he was in his head, like I realize I'm like exaggerating what I'm about to say, but if he was like in his head going, okay, if somebody comes up to me and prays for me, I'm gonna like quit my job or I'm gonna kill myself. Like, I'm sorry, but that kind of stuff happens.
Oh yeah.
And you don't know what role you played. Yep. But I get totally messed up inside because that's also just human compassion. If you see somebody hurting, your instinct is to go and to help them. That is, we are like innately built with that.
Well, because that was the only goal, was to, I saw he was upset.
Yeah.
And my only goal was to change that.
But when you
And so-
realize that you've learned a technique in
Yeah.
how you delivered that humanity, that is like appalling. And,
Yeah.
and isn't there a guy on Netflix, I think, that actually...
Yeah, is it Darren Brown that you're talking
Yes.
about?
It
Darren
might
Brown.
be.
I think
It
he's
was
a British
like
guy.
a YouTube clip, really terrible
Yeah,
quality.
yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm not
If you
sure.
go on
but-
Netflix, he has an entire, like...
Isn't it Messiah? He does one. Yeah, he does miracles or something.
Miracles,
Yeah, okay,
Darren
It's
Brown.
really like...
Yeah. He's a
like,
British
can't believe
mind
I did
reader
that.
illusionist.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I
That
think
sounds
that's
about
the
right.
guy.
Yep.
And he really, and you can construct these experiments in such a way that they mirror exactly
Yeah.
religious
Yeah.
experiences in a church or
It does make you
religious
question, like,
I had
how
a bit of
much-
a crisis after watching
Right?
that. I was
Yeah.
just like, because that was the first like thing that came to mind. But I was like, how many other people did I
Yeah.
unintentionally like the best of intentions,
Sure.
but like how may I have altered their lives in a horribly negative way?
And that's what Lynn is saying. She's like, how do I think she's saying, like, how do I move past this? Like, I was just taught this was the way, and now how do I get past this? Like, you have a lot of experience with the spanking
Yeah.
abuse.
I got a lot of spankings, man. My ass is still bruised, I think, 30 years later. Yeah. And that was the thing. I mean, our parents subscribed to the Bill Gothard theology,
Mine too.
which was big thing back in the 70s, 80s, huge in evangelicalism.
Yeah.
And it was the weird thing was Bill Gothard, he was never married. He was always single.
What?
And yeah, he never had a family, never had kids. You didn't
Are
know
you
that?
kidding me?
You didn't know this, huh?
No.
See, word of knowledge. Right here. I could change your life. No, he was never married, he never had kids, and yet he was
Who gave him
dispensing.
this authority
You
to
didn't know
speak
this.
all that
Yeah.
shit? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
He did. He told people how to raise their kids. He told people how to give
Yeah.
marriage
That is
advice.
disturbing.
It's okay. It's alright. He was anointed by God. It's all good.
Oh, yeah.
It's
It's chilling. It's good.
So yeah, that was the theology my parents subscribed to, and it changed our lives as kids massively because it was the spare the rod, spoil the child theology.
Yeah.
How did that work, by the way? Did they spoil the child?
They didn't spare the rod. That's actually I didn't feel like I was spoiled.
Man.
And it was weird because that was for them. Every misbehavior on our part was a hill worth dying on for them. So we were going through all this terrible stuff when my sister Val was pregnant when she was 17, and we were seeing our family getting torn apart. And me and my sister were acting out really badly during this time. And my parents they spanked us and spanked us and spanked us and spanked. Never once said, "Wonder why these kids are acting." Maybe it has something to do with our family being torn apart. No. That's what the Bible says.
Yeah.
Spare the rod, spoil
It's
the
not
child.
a human response. That's for sure.
Spank them. And no self-reflective piece in there of going, why is this happening? Maybe it's something to do with what we're doing as parents.
Yeah.
Nope. It's just discipline. And that's what Lynn's saying. If I wasn't doing this, I was actually disobeying God by not spanking my kids, by not doing this. And so we've got all this trauma to deal with coming out of our childhood. And then you become a part of the system, as you say, and you're just in the manipulation.
Well, that's the interesting thing about like religion is an entity unto itself. Like it propagates, it wants to survive just as much as any living organism does.
Yeah.
And so like parenting from a fundamentalist perspective, especially, you're not raising a human, you're raising a replicant of what you are.
Yes.
Like you're not supposed to
Reproducing.
you're not supposed to create a thinking human person that
That's
can
right.
make their own decisions. You're raising a clone of this
Yeah.
fundamentalism.
That's like a call in the Bible. Like after the flood, like go forth and multiply. Like make my nation great. Essentially, like
Right.
I misquote obviously, but
Yeah. But a lot of Christians even now are saying that's the way we're going to win the world.
Yep.
We're going to raise godly children. We're going to have lots of kids. We're going to raise them as godly kids, in our system.
Mm-hmm.
And we're literally going to take over the world.
And that's why
for
you
God.
see them with the children in like political marches and stuff. And I always feel so bad because these children don't actually understand what they're advocating for or against. They have no concept of the hate rhetoric that they are saying. They're just innocent and they're being programmed to hate certain people groups or causes.
We were those kids. Like our parents. If you remember the story, our parents took us to like an anti-abortion rally.
I was just thinking of that.
And And at the time I was like, I mean, yeah, I guess I'm against abortion. Like everyone says I should be, so I guess I am. Like, I haven't really thought about it, but like we marched on the Planned Parenthood, and it was just like, in retrospect, like supremely effed up. Like,
what the hell?
Yeah, and so like even then I was kind of uncomfortable. That like in retrospect, I'm like very ashamed of that.
Well, I remember that too. Kind of like. I didn't really understand why we were there. I just knew there was a confrontational element to it, and I was very uncomfortable.
It was very militant, like
yes,
absolutely.
Like we're marching on this Planned Parenthood, this establishment. Like we are going there, and we're showing force essentially. Like
it's like a battle. It's a culture war, isn't it? They see themselves as being involved in the culture war. Homosexuality and abortion are the two big things, really, for evangelicalism.
Yeah. It's always about private parts. Like honestly. What is it with the Christians and the evangelicals?
Well, sexuality.
Sexuality in general. Why is it so important? Like, I would like to know where that came from. Like, who established that this is the biggest problem we have?
Well, if you look at
is what your penis is doing and what your vagina is doing. Like, where did that come from?
Yeah. Well, if you look at it's a fantastic, it's an evil genius, fantastic control mechanism. Because if you take something as natural and normal as a sex drive, convince somebody that it's evil, it's innate. Like, it's not something you can just turn off.
Exactly.
But you have to try. And inevitably, when you fail, you come crawling back to God
and you're shamed.
And it's like
God will help you somehow.
Exactly. And so you introduce the disease and then offer the cure. Like it's just a very effective.
It's self-propagating, self-perpetuating system. That's exactly right.
And especially if you get them young enough. Like for me, Luke and I are pretty different in this regard. Like as far as like how this affected us. But like for me, I knew very early on that sex was a bad word. I didn't want to know anything. Yeah. I avoided all knowledge of it because if I knew about it, I would then I would have to deal with the responsibility of that knowledge. So I tried to be as ignorant as possible for as long as possible.
Be pure.
Exactly. Yeah. And so then, when the inevitable happens, then you're just filled with just deep shame.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And that combined with my fundamental just self-loathing of just existing because I'm an evil human, an evil sinner in the hands of an angry God, that just introduced that cycle of constant reinforcement to the point where I much better now, but I going to therapy and stuff, just kind of deconstructing all of that.
Yeah.
Got to a point where it's I was very fortunate to not have committed suicide because
it happened. It happened. Yes. Well, that's a very common cycle, isn't it? Because kids are told that sex is evil and dirty and wrong, and you got to be pure till you're married. You're supposed to be a virgin on your wedding day. Mm-hmm. Both of you have to be virginal. And then, so what happens in a lot of cases, I've done a lot of research on what happens to kids growing up in purity culture. So they'll get addicted to pornography because in their minds they're thinking, well, technically it's not sex, but then that introduces a whole nother issue because I know pornography is evil and wrong and dirty, but it's not technically sex. Yeah. But now I'm addicted to this, and now I'm racking my head and brains with God is angry and disappointed with me, and
the crazy,
just
the crazy cognitive dissonance too is because I was very successful at maintaining ignorance for an incredibly long time.
Keeping almost separate lives and separate lives.
Just not even any conversation or any information about sex, I would immediately shut off and avoid it. I would
wall it off.
And so I didn't even know what pornography was until I'd been using it for about a year.
Wow.
Oh, so this is porn.
Yeah. This is how was it on my phone? What is this? And so but I knew it was wrong. I knew it inherently. I knew it was absolutely the worst thing a human could do.
Yeah.
But I didn't know exactly what it was.
What to do about it.
The way that I was raised is my mom, it's coming from a female perspective. So my mother informed me of certain things that would happen to my body, but I was never told the ins and outs of what sex was. So everything was very mysterious.
Yeah.
And then you go to school and you're getting these strange half answers from friends, and then the sexual education is just, again, very mysterious, and you're just so confused. And when things started to occur and there's feelings and thoughts and it's almost like there was an automatic shame that just kind of you put on, but you're never really told to put it on. That's what I found anyway. It's not like something was ever directly said in the churches I grew up in, but it was there.
It's implied.
It was an implication. Exactly.
It's so powerful that even non-religious people experience that shame.
Right.
Like, it's so cultural, it's so ingrained in even the secular culture at this point that, in America at least, like, it's not the case necessarily in more European countries.
It's so different.
But like over here, just largely because of like the rating system and stuff, but like kids will watch mindless violence for hours.
Yeah.
But you show like a bikini and we've got an issue. Right? Yeah. So it's like an act of murder is okay for a kid to watch, but an act of love is not.
So like my son is 11, my oldest, and these are times when I know that these kinds of things are changing in his body, and some of his friends are starting to talk about this stuff. And I went to him one day and I was like, so here it is. We're gonna have a little conversation. And
the birds and the bees.
We didn't give the whole story because he wasn't quite ready. But I said to him, it's very normal to start feeling things and to want to touch yourself. And I was like, I just want you to know that that's okay. And he's like, you'd think he would have been uncomfortable, but he wasn't. He was like, it was like this turning of like, wait a minute, what? That's not bad? And I said, the only time it's ever going to be harmful to you is if you're using it in replacement of sharing your feelings and expressing your emotions. Like anything else, smoking cigarettes are probably not the best for you if you're replacing that habit, right?
Yeah.
And it opened a door for him to realize that there was nothing wrong with his body. Why couldn't someone have done that for me?
Where did they expect us to learn about?
Where did they expect it? I said to him, I want you to hear this from me and not on the street and not from your little buddies who don't know what they're talking about.
Or they learn it from porn or something else.
And then they're going to get married or have relationships in any capacity and be so confused as to what intimacy is and what sex is and what lust is. And you know what? Like, we have opportunity in this whole reconstruction to change a lot of things for generations.
But it's not easy. It's not easy.
It's
in
not
fact,
easy.
It's because it's so all pervasive and it's all part of our identity and worldview and backstory. Yeah. You can't just disentangle yourself from it in 5 minutes. I mean, it's a lifelong process. This is another thing, going back to my tweet, all the questions that I put. The other problem that we still have is ongoing relationships with friends and family who are still in the system. That's another huge thing. And you hear that a lot, especially on the ex-evangelical Facebook page and on Twitter. My parents are very manipulative. My friends that are still in the system they're preaching sermons at me and they're doing things. We hear that a lot. Like, let's say someone who has a couple kids, they drop them off at grandma and grandpa's house and they'll come home with a Bible and they'll come home with tracts and they'll take them to church while they're over at grandma and grandpa's house for the weekend. And then how do you have that conversation with grandma and grandpa? Please don't take my children to your church. What's wrong with taking them to church? That's the, and they're worried about our salvation too, because we've walked away. I mean, I was telling you, my sister's disowned me because I've walked away from the church and everything. And I'm thinking that's her strategy to win me back. I'll disown you to win you back in.
At the Derek Webb House show last night, like, we didn't know anything about him and prior to going to the show. Mm-hmm. But he had a line towards the end of his set. It was one of the last lines in the last song, I think. But it was something to the effect of excommunication. I'm paraphrasing. It was like excommunication is a great way to say you'll never leave while you abandon me.
And while it's actually happening.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's like, oh wow, okay.
That's what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's true. And that's the question. So what I concluded with, we got all these issues and I said, would you add more to it? And I got a lot of more responses. Mm-hmm. How important is it, I asked, to find help? Counseling, therapy. A lot of people have to do that. Mm-hmm. I did it. How important is it to have a supportive and empowering community around you in this recovery process? Would you add anything else to the list? Bethany said, therapy, recovering from religion and Sunday assembly has helped me meet more people. The sense of community has been empowering.
Yeah.
And I think I hear that a lot from people. I was just talking to Steve Slocum last night. We did a podcast about his new book. And he said on the way... Which
sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's about Muslim-American Christian relationship. It's called Why Do They Hate Us? So that's going to be a podcast coming out in a few months. But is fascinating. But on the way up last night to pick her up, he said that this is a major problem. He walked away from the church over 20 years ago, and he didn't know anything about anybody doing it too. So it was a very, very lonely place. And you hear that a lot. So at least there's communities like Hippie Heretic and Evangelical and other communities online that, I mean, we would have never met had it not been for Evangelical. I live in Britain, you live in Canada, but yet
people ask all the time, how did you meet this guy? I'm like,
we're random strangers.
That Facebook group has been super helpful for me because it's like, because you can't talk about this when you're in religion. And so when you come out of it, so I was fortunate enough to already be in a very secular community by the time I was deconstructing all this stuff. I was like the lone Christian in my group of friends. So it was very seamless for me to find community outside of that. So it was kind of one of those things where like I still felt very alone because I could tell anybody my story and nobody would get it. Nobody would understand at all. And so like,
because they didn't come from that
exactly.
culture.
They like I had a conversation with a friend who, didn't understand why religion just messed me up so bad. And like, until I like really broke down what I actually believed.
Yeah.
And then she got it. But people just don't inherently understand that if they haven't gone through that. So just like seeing other people's stories and seeing myself in all these people's stories, I'm just like, and some far worse than what I dealt with. And so it's just been a great resource to see like, oh, this is a normal thing.
Yeah.
Like this is not, I'm not alone.
You're not alone.
I'm not an isolated case here.
You're not crazy. You're not alone.
It's incredibly validating.
There are dozens of us.
Dozens.
There are dozens of us. Yes. He gets it.
When I started to pull stuff apart, nobody had any clue what I was talking about, and they literally just kind of like let go and stood back and were scared. Yeah, I felt like they were disgusted by me.
You got a virus.
I did it all alone, and then randomly went online and I was like, there has to be somebody else. And then that's when I started to find all these groups, and literally there's a group called Posse of Online Spiritual Misfits. That group literally saved me. Like, I was like so close to being done because I was so isolated. And if it had not been for groups like Evangelical still today, I still feel alone. Like, it's weird because I almost feel like we're like all these little secret people all over. And then when you start to realize that you're so close to each other, like some of the people we met last night, we're so close. We're like an hour away. I'm like, oh, there's life. There's hope, you know?
Well, and every time I've come to Seattle, I've always tried to get people together. Every time I've been coming back and forth since about May. My wife was over here taking care of my father-in-law who was dying of a brain tumor. So I kept coming back and visiting and then working. And I've always tried to get a group together for that very reason.
Exactly.
We met at Starbucks in Federal Way the first time I was here. We just sat around and we just said, well, what's your story? What's your story? What's your story? And that was so empowering. That the connectivity there of meeting people from different, but we all have a similar story. They're all different but similar somehow. It's hugely empowering.
And sometimes people need the therapy. Like, you need to go and have that. And I think that that's really important. I just don't think that it's always an option. Like, for myself, I didn't have that option. Just having a family and like the costs and even finding someone who actually understands what you're saying. So to have even just people who aren't like professionals still kind of, in a sense, like, I feel like these groups are counselors.
Well, it is empowering. I got another response from a gal. She was supposed to be here today, but something came up. Her name's Elena Marlowe. She's a spiritual transitions coach right here in Seattle.
I like the sound of that.
Yeah. She said yes to all of it, what I said. She said, I 100% support therapy for those who can access it. That's an issue, isn't it? Not everyone can access it, can afford it, so there are other options. But she said, I found that my reconstruction was one step in a pathway through grief. So that kind of goes back to your point, doesn't it? There's a passage through hell. It's a pathway through grief. I like how she said that. The loss of what I believed, my former identity, how it impacted my life and relationships, to let that go and embrace my evolved self. So embracing the person that we're becoming. She said, finally, I coupled therapy with life coaching to help rebuild my sense of identity and begin reorienting my life on my new terms. That's a great way to put it, isn't it? It is. You have to reorient your life on your new terms. I explore resources and meetup groups from various perspectives defined what brought me life, and began incorporating that.
That we are in control of our life, that a group is not, that a belief system is not in control.
Yeah.
And you're right. One step in a pathway through grief, because that is how it happened for me. I'm sure others too. It had to begin with suffering. I had to embrace the suffering. That is actually like the first part of my book is called Embracing the Pain. So I had to acknowledge that this was there. And usually that's what counselors help you do.
Yeah. Well, not everyone can access it.
But we can't access it.
That's a huge, like, because I think some people it's not as, so my roommate, for example, is like, we had very similar upbringings, and we've come to essentially the same place, but for very different reasons. I was indoctrinated well before I had any reliable critical thought. He's had critical thought for a long time. He never really accepted anything on face value. And so even though he was in the culture and he had the same guilt that I did, he didn't have the same shame. So he was able to make a much cleaner break from that kind of stuff. Because he was able to detach, like, oh, I did something bad. I feel bad. I'm good now. I was very much I am bad. I did something bad. I'm still bad.
And
so
that's the difference. You said I am bad, and that's the identity piece. And so
that's huge.
And so for me, it was very much like I developed major recurring depressive disorder when I was 17, and I didn't have the framework to understand that was depression. Because depression in my mind at the time was a moral failing. It's like, oh, I'm not trusting Jesus enough. I gotta pray harder. I gotta do
sin in your life or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Something wrong with you.
There's something wrong with me.
That's the bottom line.
Yeah, exactly.
It's your fault, your problem.
Yeah, and it all everything plays into it, but it all, just kind of, it's a lot of little stuff and a lot of bigger stuff just kind of started compounding, and it would, it started out bad, and then it got worse. And then it would go away, and then it'd come back, but it'd be worse, and it'd last longer, and every time that happened, it would just it was just exponential.
And do you feel like you had a deeper and deeper sense of losing yourself in the process of every time that would come back? Like, the concept of
it got to the point where I was, atheism saved my life.
Wow.
Hands down. I would have, had I not gotten therapy, had I not deconstructed my former faith and come to the understanding that this is it, I would absolutely have killed myself eventually. I don't know how long it would have taken, but it was just not a sustainable trajectory. There was no way around it. Because it was fundamentally wrong with me. So at a certain point I could cope up until I couldn't cope anymore. And once I reached that point, it would have been over. It was an inevitability and to a certain degree. And so when I finally kind of stepped back and was like, oh, wait, I'm in control of where I go. This is, I'm not some pawn of some allegedly benevolent sky father that loves me enough to send me to hell.
But not if you're elect.
Yeah, exactly, right? Exactly.
And then doesn't matter what you do.
Exactly.
You're an asshole.
Yep. And so I had this moment where I was kind of, it was just this moment of pure nihilism where I was like, the earth could disappear and the universe would still exist. None of this means anything more than it means. Matters. It's just, we're here and that's it. Yeah. I don't have to save anybody's soul because at the end of the day, we're all going to die and we're all going to be forgotten eventually.
It's funny because I went there, but I was able to hold it from a different perspective to say it doesn't matter, but for a different reason. It doesn't matter because I'm completely loved. However, this divine being that created me, I know that if he created me, then I'm fully loved and embraced. I had a completely same experience and realization, but came to a different conclusion. And yet, I listen to you. I hear the peace that you have in your life. And I'm like, as a Christian, that should bother me if I was back there, right? In the evangelical, oh my God, you don't believe the same thing as me? And yet, I look at that and I think, that is such an amazing perspective. I've never even looked at it that way and going there to, we were just talking about this on the way here, how we were never allowed to have those kind of thoughts and disagreements in terms of theology because we all had to believe the same thing. And yet now we find that so impacting.
Yeah, it's huge.
It sounds silly, but you just opened up a whole another concept inside of me that I have to unpack later.
Thanks for that. Now you have more work to do. I
think for me it was just because I had the weight of the world on my shoulders. I had to save souls, because if I didn't save souls, I was not doing my job, which means I am going to hell.
Right.
And so I had the whole world on my shoulders. And in that moment, I was like, I don't have to save anybody. We're all, the fate, everybody's fate is the same.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have to save anybody except myself.
You're not responsible for anything but yourself.
Exactly. And so it was just kind of this profound liberation where I was just like, because a lot of people look at nihilism like nothing means anything, and that's a scary thing for a lot of people. And for me, it was just beautiful.
Wow.
It was like I have a very death positive, I'm like, I've come to a place where death is like the reason I don't kill myself is because I'm like, I'm going to die eventually.
Yeah.
I'm going to die eventually. Why should I rush the process? Like, this is finite. Death is absolutely going to happen.
Also,
like
life goes by so fast anyway.
Yeah.
Like,
there's no
years. Like, what's that? Like,
there's no need to rush the process.
Yeah.
Like, it's a very comforting, because I don't want to exist forever. That is eternal torture, eternal bliss. It's all the same. It's all the same to me. I do not want to consciously exist forever. So death is just a comfort to me. I'm like, when I die, whenever that is, that's perfectly fine with me. So I don't need to rush the process. I know it's going to happen.
It's about being at rest in the now.
Exactly. It makes everything now much more meaningful.
I think Western culture has a really toxic relationship with death, and I think that stems from our Anglo-Saxon Christianity, to be honest.
I think we have people that are coming in. No?
They're like, no, we don't want to.
Okay, you don't want to. You can come in. Okay.
No worries.
Thumbs up. All right. Well, I was going to say, we should probably wrap it up because it's being about an hour. Oh, you are going to come in. Come on, you're on Facebook Live anyway.
Right.
So you're gonna,
sit down, chicken.
Come on in. No, come on in.
Sit.
Hello. We're just about ready to finish, but thank you for coming in. There's a one last thing I was going to read from Sean, another response to my tweet. He said, I've learned that everyone's journey is different. And that's true, isn't it? We're all on a different path. We're somehow similar, but somehow totally different. He said, I've deconstructed and have started to rebuild, but I'm in a constant state of remodeling as well. Embracing the journey and not sticking to a timeline have been incredibly healing. And I thought that's very profound too, because we're all on a different journey, sort of similar, but very different. And then not sticking to a timeline. You have to be here, you have to be there at a certain time. Well, we're all on different developmental paths.
And I think we've seen the journey in deconstruction all look very different, yet somehow kind of similar in some ways. Yeah. And you've been keeping track, have you not, of like all the different ways that people have gone? Like,
yeah, it's really fascinating. I wrote an article called "What Happens After People Leave the Church," and I realized that people, as I got more and more and more responses, I've got 13 possible paths that people take. And that's not, it's an ever-growing, expanding list. It's a spectrum is what it is. Yeah. It's a spectrum. Anywhere from staying a Christian but leaving the church because you've been burned or hurt or whatever, to the angry atheist, angry theist, struggling theist, agnostic, whatever. There's a lot of different paths that people take, and I'm adding more categories all the time to the spectrum. And that's been a hugely empowering thing for me to realize that it's not about a right path or a wrong path. Right. I'm a number 5 and you're a number 12 at this moment.
Or I started out.
Well, and that's
and I've moved on the scale.
In like growing up, everything was so binary. It's good, it's bad, it's black, it's white. It has to be one male, female. It has to be one or the other. There can't be this mixture. Yeah. But that is antithetical to who I am as like a person. Yeah. And like I've always been more comfortable with gray. That whole construct of there being a right way to do this or a wrong way to do this. It's like, I was like, Luke and I were talking with my roommate yesterday about, he said something like, this is way better than this. And I was like, well, it's different, but like there are certain contexts in which I prefer that. But I can see why this would be good in a certain way, like. But also over here, you've got, and so it's just, I'm just like, I can't.
Too many options.
I can't say this is the best. I can't say this is better. I can't like any binary sense of like positive, negative. It's like, no, this is one thing, and then this is also a thing. Yeah. And then this is something else. Like they're all here.
But that's the beauty of humanity, is because it's like stained glass, and we are all different pieces, and we are coming together, and we're starting to see that there's actually a better picture than the evangelical picture that we were taught to put together, because it was so boring. It was just all like you're expected to be this exact same color and the same shape. And now we're realizing that we're all broken, and look at how beautifully we come together. And I think that that's actually possible for reconstructing as well. because we already, like, you have 13 categories of how it's looking when people are taking their stuff apart. Yeah. But what could that look like in realizing how people are putting their stuff back together? Like how I'm putting my life together and how they are and how you are is completely different. But again, it's all these fractals that are coming together and creating this magnificent picture. And for me, that's really hopeful because I feel like I actually have the opportunity to change humanity with my life in this way. Is so simple. I just get to be me.
Yeah,
I don't have to follow any rules. I don't have to do anything except be the completeness of who I am meant to be. And I say that to everybody, like, that means in entirety. Like, I don't care what your sexual preference is. If that is who you are, then well done. You are contributing to this beautiful place and making it even more dazzling, you know? If you feel like you need to be an atheist, I welcome that because I can learn from you. And I think that the freedom to, like, we were talking about in the car over here that in deconstruction, it's like a house of cards and everything falls down. But I was saying, like, you don't even want to, like, put it together in stone. I feel like you want to put it together with Lego blocks because then you can like remove and you
it's much easiasier to take apart.
Since deconstructing, like I've come to a point where I'm like I hold every belief that I have loosely.
Right.
Because if new information comes along that like renders it invalidated, then it's like why would I hold on to that? Like that's what I did for 23 years.
Exactly.
so important.
Yeah, and so just being willing to change because change is really it's just that's everything.
So like we're going to get an entirely new list now for Reconstruction. I think you're going to start seeing a really actually large adaptation of what it's going to look like for people to start putting their lives together.
Yeah, and I keep coming back to what you said, and you said too that the huge irony in the whole thing is that all these things, they were promised to us in church. I mean, I remember saying this many, many times when I preached, become the person that God made you to be, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I said it. That was one of our core values on a piece of paper somewhere. And yet that's not what happened.
No.
Not at all. I was forced into a conceptual box. I would say I learned some things about myself in that system. Some of the gifts, I guess I would say I have, or abilities, skills, whatever.
But to be fair, you could have learned that from
I could have learned that
anywhere.
Test. Well, right? Yeah, it's true. But I learned it within the system,
True,
but that was the piece that we were supposed to be. Yeah. And yet it took leaving the system to become me, to become who I'm supposed to be or who I am or whatever that means, and I feel like I don't care anymore what people think of me.
And we love your beard.
Yeah, they were trying to cut it off this morning.
We were not trying to cut it off.
They suggested snipping, but yeah.
He asked me to braid it and I said, are you sure you just don't need it?
No, I don't like that, But that's part of going out and getting, because I had tattoos for a long time, but I never got anything below, because I was always like, what are people going to think? Who cares, man? I don't care. This is what I want to be. This is who I am. Yeah. This is what I'm going to do. If you have a problem with it, oh well, we'll have to figure that out.
And that's why I'm learning to be so much more free in speaking publicly, because I always feared the backlash, but now I just feel like every day I'm stronger to be able to say, I actually just don't care. If you don't accept me, that's actually not my problem. Yeah. That's your problem. I'm completely cool with myself. Every day, stronger. Yeah, it is a process.
Yeah. Embracing the journey. So that's what it's all about, isn't it? But yeah, so how do we reconstruct? It's I don't know. I don't know if we've answered that question, but we've certainly dove into it. A deep dive, I hope. Yeah. So thanks everybody for being a part of this live podcast.
And I want to make sure that your listeners actually, so I actually set up a special code online so that all of your listeners, if they want to get a copy of my book, The Resting Traveler Into the Forest, they can head to the website, which is, or Amazon even, therestingtraveler.com. And if you hit in MIND30, so MIND30, they'll get 30% off of their purchase. So it's the biggest discount I've ever offered for any of my podcasts.
Very cool.
And then everybody here today gets a free copy as well. So.
Sweet. You got a free book. So thank you, Stacie Rae. Thanks to everyone who came out. People came down from Canada, everywhere, Stanwood, Washington, everywhere for this. San Diego. Yeah. Stay classy. He's never seen the movie Anchorman. Have you seen it?
No.
He's from San Diego. Never seen anything.
And we've got to thank our camera gal, Demi,
Demi,
who's
for showing up
took care of us today. Thank you.
Our guy that was supposed to film it, his car broke down on the way in this morning.
And I got a message
So
that someone's
sadly-
got to go get him.
Oh, good. So he might join us for lunch. We're going to go for lunch afterwards. So thanks, everyone, for being a part of this great podcast. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have.
Absolutely.
It's been a great
Anytime.
discussion. So thank you so much for being a part of it.
Thanks for having
All
me.
right. You know what's really humbling for me as the host of this podcast that I started almost 2 years ago now, coming up, it'll be 2 years in February. I originally started it, as some of you know, it was called the Preacher's Forum Podcast, and that's why the name is still attached to some of it, because that's what I started it out as. You know, I was really passionate about reforming the church from within, being that sort of lone prophetic voice. I was going to be that preacher crying out in the wilderness, trying to help the church, and I was very passionate about that. But you know, as the years have gone by now, I have realized that no, my whole original goal no longer fits where I'm at personally in terms of my own deconstruction. I no longer believe in the same things that I believed in a year and a half, 2 years ago, and that's why I changed the name of this podcast from the Preacher's Forum to MindShift. I've been on this journey of deconstruction and now this journey of reconstruction. And what's humbling to me, as I say, is that not only have I met and cultivated relationships with wonderful people like Stacie Rae. In fact, it was kind of funny because someone said to us, how did you two even meet? How are you even here? You, Clint, live in the United Kingdom. You're not even supposed to be here. And Stacie, you came down from Canada. How in the world did you two meet? But if it wasn't for the ex-evangelical community, the Facebook page, my post-evangelical writers group, and some of the other connections we made online, we would have never met, and we would have never come together to do this podcast as well as the one we did several months back. But it's humbling to me that people came like Jimmy Brower. He drove over 4 hours to come all the way up from Eugene, Oregon, just because he had happened to catch something I posted on Twitter, listened to a couple of episodes literally on the way up. People drove all the way down from Canada. And yes, okay, they were coming in for the Derek Webb concert, but they certainly didn't have to make the effort the next day to come all the way out to the Kent, Washington area just to be a part of this podcast. People came from a long ways and they were interested and passionate. And as you heard in the podcast, we had some fantastic discussions and got in some really meaty topics. And it's made me think, okay, there is absolutely something to this whole thing of reconstructing after deconstructing. This is why, as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm passionate about doing this online course. If you want to be a part of that, you can do that course. And I hope that it will help you think through and process through some of the complex issues and emotions and topics around this whole piece. So hopefully you will find that course to be a helpful resource for you in this reconstruction process. And I'll just mention as well that the links are going to be in the show notes. I think I'm going to also put it up on YouTube too, on the MindShift podcast channel, so you can take a look at the video there too. Okay, just before I let you go, don't forget next week we've got a great conversation with Sherry Palace. She's going to be talking about how she thinks man or humanity has ruined God, co-opted him and Jesus for their own ends, which we certainly see in the North American context anyway, co-opting God and Jesus for political and religious ends. So we're going to get into that next week with Sherry Palace. So stay tuned for that coming up. Thanks for joining me and Stacie Rae along with a live audience as we really took a deep dive into the subject of reconstruction after deconstruction. Hopefully it's been a helpful one for you. If so, I'd love to hear from you. Send me your thoughts on Twitter at MindShift 2018. And I will catch you next Friday with Sherry Palace right here on MindShift Podcast.